In her article titled What Are the Theosophists, that she wrote in 1879, H.P. Blavatsky wrote that, be what he may, once that a student abandons the old and trodden highway of routine and enters upon the solitary path of independent thought, Godward, he is a theosophist, an original thinker, a seeker after the eternal truth, with an inspiration of his own to solve the universal problems. And probably no one in the years since that was written has fit that description better than Abraham Maslow, one of the most widely loved and influential and inspiring psychologists of the 20th century, and one of the founding or principal founders of the humanist movement in psychology. He died in 1970 at the age of 62, and he left an extensive body of published books, as well as many articles that appeared in professional journals. And from the standpoint of the larger theosophical movement, it seems fair to say that Maslow's work was and remains profoundly important because it opened up avenues of investigation and research and leading to at least the beginnings of recognition of the godlike potentialities within every human being. He worked within the arena of Western psychology, which by the 1920s and 30s had become largely materialistic and reductive in its purview. Human beings were viewed as the products of their environment and circumstances, and shaped and determined by their conditioning from the time of their birth, where they started out as essentially as blank slates. And against this against the backdrop of these prevailing assumptions, which are still with us and probably less than they were back in the before World War II. But against these assumptions, Maslow he very bravely put forth the affirmation based on his own study that human beings are intrinsically good and decent. And when in a state of psychological health, they can and often act in wonderful, benevolent, and saintly and sagacious ways, accomplishing great things and being of great benefit to others and to the world. He saw strong evidence of a higher nature as an essential component of every human being, as a potential that was deeply real and not merely a sentimental or poetic reference. And he did this in his role as a trained professional psychologist and a dedicated scientist through his own honest and careful observations and intuitive sensibilities. He became well known for his concepts of the hierarchy of human needs and motivations and the processes of growth and maturation that he termed self-actualization and transcendence. These concepts were for Maslow always evolving. He was continually exploring and questioning and verifying and refining and thinking deeply and clear up to his dying day. And we could say that he was as much of a philosopher as he was a psychologist. Now, in an interview he did in 1960, the interviewer posed the question, aren't these principles the same basic values that every religion and philosophy has attempted to find? A quest as old as cultures themselves. And Maslow replied, he said, I think my approach differs tremendously. It is certainly true that mankind throughout history has looked for guiding values, for principles of right and wrong, but he has tended to look outside of himself, outside of mankind, to a God, to some sort of sacred book, perhaps, or to a ruling class. What I am doing is exploring the theory that you can find the values by which mankind must live, and for which man has always sought, by digging into the best people in depth. I believe, in other words, that I can find ultimate values which are right for mankind by observing the best of mankind. If, under the best conditions and in the best specimens, I simply stand aside and describe in a scientific way what these human values are, I find values that are the old values of truth, goodness, beauty, and some additional ones as well. For instance, gaiety, justice, and joy. In an article that was first published in 1958, it's called The Mission of the Psychologist. He had this to say: academic psychology is too exclusively Western and not Eastern enough. It turns too much to the objective, to the public, the outer, to behavior. It should learn more about the inner, the subjective, the meditative, the private. Introspection should be brought back into psychological research. Behaviorism originated in a sensible reaction against anthropomorphizing animal psychology. But the reverse sin has happened instead of rodentomorphizing human psychology, of studying the person as if he were no more than a complicated white rat. It is truly a mistake to attribute human motives to laboratory animals, but is it a mistake to attribute human motives to humans? Maslow was drawn to the work of John Watson and B.F. Skinner early on in his career, and to the behaviorist theories that they were promulgating. It was the dominant trend in psychology in the early 30s. And he did much of his graduate work in labs, studying rats and primates. But over time, Maslow became increasingly disenchanted with the behaviorist approach, which he found too limiting. He thought it was suitable for lab work and had its usefulness in some applications of psychotherapy. But as he put it later, it does not generate an adequate image of man, a philosophy of life, a conception of human nature. It's not an adequate guide to living or to value or to choices. And he often explained that one of the major events in his life that brought about this reconsideration was the birth of his daughter. He said it changed him as a psychologist when he looked into the eyes of his infant daughter. He sensed something within, a unique presence. And after his second child came along, he could see that there were distinct differences, and this was no blank slate. And he could no longer stomach the behaviorist approach. After getting his doctorate degree in psychology, a field for which he had a deep passion and which he worked in the rest of his life. He taught and he did research at Berkeley College, and then took a position for many years at Brandeis University. Now, Maslow's work was, in large part, it was a pioneering effort to develop a psychology of health. Before Maslow, the field of psychology didn't have much of any conception of what it meant to be psychologically healthy, other than as an absence of pathology. As he put it, it is as if Sigmund Freud supplied us the sick half of psychology, and now we must fill it out with the healthy half. So Maslow is largely known for his theory that he developed of human needs and motivations. He posited a hierarchy ranging from the basic physiological needs of food, shelter, and clothing to the safety needs of safety and security, freedom from fear. Then there's the belonging and love, the needs for friends, family, and so forth. Then comes self-esteem, achievement, recognition, uh, one's reputation. And these were what he called deficiency needs or extrinsic needs, for which the satisfaction comes mainly from the outside. There's the motivation is towards it's looking out. It seeks its satisfaction through things that are outside of us, and so we call these deficiency or deficit needs. Or extrinsic needs. And then the higher needs he termed being needs, or sometimes growth needs. And these he described as actualization. And later on, he added the term transcendence to that, as even higher. And it's well, the general idea he proposed was that the lower levels of needs must be satisfied before the higher types of needs can present themselves. So, for instance, a lack of food or shelter will become the immediate and most driving need. And then come the security and safety needs, after which the need for relationships and friendships and for self-esteem and so forth. And then once these deficiencies or extrinsic needs are met and integrated, then the being needs of self-actualization and transcendence can become motivating factors. And Maslow stressed that this is not a simplistic progression, but it is a process taking place at many levels and at many different areas of our life and events and circumstances. And changes are always taking place, whereby one might, be kind of traveling back and forth in this, and so there's this chart you see here is in a sense way too simplistic, and it's not a progression from one level to the next, but these do represent different levels or categories of needs, and I think we could maybe think of it also as everything from self-esteem down as kind of being, what's going on in our lower nature. It's our personality, our likes and dislikes, our passions and desires, and so this is kind of a dynamics of these various motivations in which our consciousness is engaged, looking at it from the point of view of the personality, and then the higher aspect is more self-driven. It's more comes from within, the self-actualization, which he calls the intrinsic or being needs. And it's almost in a way we could maybe draw parallels to the idea of the psychic and the noetic. I think it's kind of an interesting way of looking at these dynamics of the personality. Um, and he pointed out that mental illness is often gets established as a result of these needs not being fulfilled or properly integrated or dealt with. Maslow, as we said, he took on the project of trying to describe what it means to be a truly healthy and highly functioning human being, a study which extended over many years. His study was first published in 1950 in a psychological journal, and it was titled Self-Actualizing People, a Study of Psychological Health. And it later became a chapter in his book, Motivation and Personality. And the approach he took was based on the idea that you would select for study those individuals who seem to be the most well-adjusted and free of obvious pathologies, who are happy in their lives, who enjoyed their work, who got along well with others, who were responsible and kind and helpful and doing useful things. People who took joy in growing and learning and who had a mission in life. Just as if you're going to try and find out what human beings were capable of by way of athletic achievements, you wouldn't study just anyone off the street. You would look at Olympic medalists and the most outstanding athletes. So his study included individuals he encountered in his own life and career, whom he greatly admired. Several historical characters, such as Thomas Jefferson and Abe Lincoln, whom he also greatly admired, and as well as people from various walks of life who met certain criteria of psychological health and well-being, whose lives seemed useful and exemplary. Albert Schweitzer was one he included in his study, as was Eleanor Roosevelt. And he later, he described he described what he was doing in this study, and he said, "The one thing I have no doubt, when you select out for careful study very fine and healthy people, sagacious people, in fact, exactly the kind of people I picked out, then you get a different view of mankind. You are asking, how tall can people grow? What can a human being become?" He described the subjects of his study as self-actualizing and found certain characteristics that they seem to have in common and which could be considered as components of psychological health. So just does what does self-actualization mean? And he defined it in his paper on the hierarchy of needs. He said, self-actualization refers to man's desire for self-fulfillment, namely to the tendency for him to become actualized in what he is potentially. This tendency might be phrased as the desire to become more and more what one idiosyncratically is, to become everything that one is capable of becoming. Well, here's I'm going to give a very brief summary of several of these characteristics. And there's, of course, quite a bit of overlap. And for two of these characteristics, we have some video of Maslow himself discussing them and from an interview that he did in 1967. But this is from his paper on self-actualization. He said that these qualities that he noticed or detected or was able to generalize about all of these people were they all had efficient perceptions of reality. They're able to judge situations correctly and honestly. And they're very sensitive to the superficial and the dishonest. And they are not easily fooled, and they can quickly detect phoniness. They have a comfortable acceptance for others and of nature. They accept their own human nature with all of its flaws. The shortcomings of others and the contradictions of the human condition are accepted with humor and tolerance. They rely on their own experiences and judgments. They are independent, not reliant on culture and the environment to form opinions and views. They are spontaneous and natural, true to themselves rather than being how others want them to be. They are task centering. Most of his subjects had a mission to fulfill in life or some task or problem beyond themselves to pursue. And humanitarians such as Albert Schweitzer are considered to have possessed this quality. And they have a kind of a detachment and a need for privacy. And they can be solitary without discomfort, and they positively like solitude and privacy to a greater degree than the average person. And they have what he called autonomy. They're free from the reliance on external authorities or other people. They tend to be resourceful and independent. And here we have a video here of Mr. Maslow himself speaking about this. I don't know if we can get that up yet. Here we go. Okay, we'll give this a try. You might need to turn your sound up a little bit. This is an old film, of course, and it's transferred from probably a 16 millimeter film to a video, and is some of the sound is kind of lost, I think. But so if you need to.
Or interdirectedness, independence of culture and environment. They are dependent for their own development and continued growth on their own potentialities and latent resources.
Well, this was true for all subjects. And of course, it's very hard to capture with words an intangible quality like this. But if I can use these intangible words, I picked up the sense of these people being their own bosses somehow, and of doing what they themselves decided to do, and of being responsible to themselves, and not being weather vanes, not very easy to influence. I think we could study this experimentally probably today. My guess is that in the Ash kind of suggest the conformity situation, that these are the people who would resist suggestions more readily than others. It's testable enough. And that's the way they looked. It was as if they would choose what they wanted to do. You might urge them to do something, and somebody else might urge them, but it was their decision. It's very hard to describe this sense of, I picked up a phrase from Robert Louis Stevenson one, like the clocks ticking on steadily through a thunderstorm. The thunderstorm didn't affect them somehow. They were themselves, and not in the current sense of the term, other-directed, or certainly not tradition-bound. And this led into the discussion of the resistance to enculturation, because it's quite clear that this kind of person is more commonly human than our average American or our average anything else, since they all seem to be like each other, and I would guess independent of the century, independent of the culture even. Because I had one man like this was my the father, you know, in quotes, in the northern Blackfoot Indians. White-headed chief was an autonomous man. And he was autonomous in the same way that, let's say, I thought Spinoza was, or Lincoln, who made up his own mind. You couldn't diddle him around. And so for Jefferson, if you read his letters, you see so much of going against the grain, quite willing to be unpopular, if necessary. Schweitzer is the beautiful and very obvious example of just following his own star and doing what he thought best, and walking through the laughing and the criticisms and so on as if it were water and he was a duck. It just went off. Didn't bother him. I think you could take the other examples. Mrs. Roosevelt would be another example. If you remember in the 30s, total denunciation from everybody. Everybody's making fun of her and so on. And she sailed calmly through the whole business and even forgave them because she, as she said, she understood it. How could you expect something else? And she was very easy about that and went her own way. She created a new form for a president's wife, a new way of life, an active life. This was her invention, so to speak.
We'll go on to the couple more of these characteristics. One being continued freshness of appreciation. They constantly renew their appreciation of life's basic goods. A sunset or a flower will be experienced as intensely time after time as it was the first time. There's a kind of an innocence of vision like that of a child. And they have profound interpersonal relationships that are marked by deep, loving bonds. They have a non-hostile sense of humor. And they can laugh at themselves and laugh at their circumstances. And probably one of the most important aspects of the whole arena of self-actualization is what he calls peak experiences. And all of Maslow's subjects reported the frequent occurrence of peak experiences or temporary moments of self-actualization. These are, occasion were marked by feelings of ecstasy, of harmony, of deep meaning. Self-actualizers reported feeling at one with the universe, stronger and calmer than ever before, filled with light and beauty and goodness and so forth. And this is sometimes spoken of as an oceanic feeling, a feeling of deep connection with the planet, with the universe. One is reminded of Richard Byrd's description of gazing at an intensely bright, starry sky during the Antarctic winter where he was stationed, and feeling an overwhelming sense of connection and of life and intelligence pulsating and permeating throughout. It is an experience of a sort that is often deeply moving and life-changing, where one's consciousness is transported for a time, maybe just for an instant, out of the confines of the personal self. And we have one more video of Maslow speaking of the peak experience. We can get that up here.
The peak experience, the mystic experience, the oceanic feeling. Feelings of limitless horizons opening up to the vision, the feeling of being simultaneously more powerful and more helpless than one ever was before, the feeling of great ecstasy and wonder and awe, the loss of placing in time and space with, and finally the conviction that something extremely important and valuable has happened.
Yeah, it's a very good thing for a person. Magic moments, in an article I read today, they were called. Well, there is some history here, which I think would be of interest. In my subjects at first, what I stumbled across, this I wasn't looking for, were what I had to call mystic experiences. There were reports of such experiences. And I had come into this investigation with the normal equipment of the normal person of the culture, thinking that mystical experiences happen to one saint, you know, every century or something like that. And here I kept, people would talk to me in the same words as Saint Teresa or Meister Eckhart or some of these other people that I'd read, the famous mystics. Well, I've put it down that way, and but then kept on discovering more and more that these came from many triggers. They came from all kinds of sources, from the love experience or the being on top of a mountain, or just being taken over by music, or somebody going along a seashore and then just going into this state. And I had to generalize it. And furthermore, I had to strip it of its traditionally, historically religious, specifically religious meaning, because it turned out not to be. The peak experiences came from many, many things, many triggers. Once I tried to generalize them as anything that moves, anything that comes close to perfection. An experience of perfection will produce a peak experience. Whether in athletics, in one of my subjects, a young man breaking through with the ball into an open field and then running down the field and reporting in the same words that ancient mystics had used. This was a 17-year-old boy. Totally stumbling across this by the purest accident of the women in natural childbirth reporting ecstasies of mystic experiences or peak experiences. So what I want to do is to generalize that. I found since that peak experiences do not occur, they're not the exclusive prerogative of one pantheon of people, but they occur very widely through the population. It looks now, and a preliminary statement would be that the higher the degree of psychological health, the greater the frequency of peak experiences, the higher they reach, the more intense they are, and the more illuminative, that is, the more cognitive they are, the more you learn from them. If you see the world in the peak experience in a more pure form, this can be remembered. Some people do remember, some people don't remember. The people who do remember tend to be changed, just as the ancient mystics reported.
Thanks. That's in a later book, The Farther Reaches of Human Nature, that was published after he died, Maslow made some further observations concerning self-actualization, and here's some of what he says. What does one do when he self-actualizes? Does he grit his teeth and squeeze? What does self-actualization mean in terms of actual behavior, of actual procedure? Self-actualization means experiencing fully and vividly and selflessly with full concentration and total absorption. It means experiencing without the self-consciousness of the adolescent. At this moment of experiencing, the person is wholly and fully human. This is the moment when the self is actualizing. To talk of self-actualization implies that there is a self to be actualized. A human being is not a tabula rasa, not a lump of clay. Looking within oneself for many of the answers implies taking responsibility. That is in itself a great step towards actualization. Each time one takes responsibility, this is an actualizing of the self. Self-actualizing people are, without one single exception, involved in a cause outside their own skin and something outside of themselves. They are devoted, working at something, something which is very precious to them, some calling or vocation. They are working at something which fate has called them to somehow, and which they work at and which they love, so that the work-joy dichotomy in them disappears. All, in one way or another, devote their lives to the search for what I have called the being values, the ultimate values which are intrinsic, which cannot be reduced to anything more ultimate, including the truth and beauty and goodness of the ancients, and perfection, simplicity, comprehensiveness, and several more. I want to say, to mention some things about transcendence. This is a topic that Maslow gave much attention to later in his career. He thought of transcendence as an even farther extension of human potential. And in his last book, which was published posthumously, he makes a distinction between self-actualized individuals who are healthy and well-adjusted and living useful, happy lives and all that, and those he calls transcending self-actualizers. And none of this is especially well-defined and probably cannot be well-defined, but it shows the direction of his thought, and I think students of Theosophy will find much that resonates. I just want to highlight a few of his thoughts that struck me as especially interesting, and the concept of transcendence is so difficult to encompass in any definition that Maslow devotes a chapter of his book to exploring various meanings, 37 of them, in fact. And here's just some of them, which I want to kind of conclude with. Speaking of transcendence, he says it's a loss of self-consciousness, of self-awareness. It is the same kind of self-forgetfulness which comes from getting absorbed and fascinated and concentrated. In this sense, meditation or concentration on something outside one's own psyche can produce self-forgetfulness and therefore loss of self-consciousness. And in this particular sense of transcendence of the ego or of the conscious self. Transcendence in the metaphysical sense of transcending one's own skin and body and bloodstream, as in identification with the being values, so that they become intrinsic to the self itself. Transcendence of time. I can feel friendly in a very personal and affectionate way with Spinoza and Abraham Lincoln and Jefferson and William James and Whitehead, as if they still lived, which is to say that in specific ways they do still live. Transcendence of one's past. One's own past can be embraced and accepted into one's present self. This means full acceptance. It means the transcendence of remorse and guilt and regret and shame and embarrassment and the like. Transcendence of culture. The transcendent self-actualizing individual is universal, a member of the human species. The transcendence of ego, of self, selfishness, ego-centering, etc. When one is doing one's duty, this also can be seen to be under the aspect of eternity. and can represent a transcendence of the ego, of the lower needs of the self. Transcendence also means to become divine or godlike, to go beyond the merely human. But one must be careful here not to make anything extra human or supernatural out of this kind of statement. I am thinking of using the word metahuman in order to stress that this becoming very high or divine or godlike is part of human nature, even though it is not often seen. In fact, it is still a potentiality of human nature. So I'm going to close with a final quotation from Maslow. He's specifically speaking here of self-actualization. However, the comments he makes would certainly apply to all who are moving in the direction of self-reformation and to a deeper understanding of themselves, and who are seeking to become wiser, more compassionate, more intelligent, more useful human beings. And here's what he says: self-actualization is not a state of being, but it's a process. It's a direction, not a destination. This process won't always bring feelings of happiness and contentment and bliss, and it may even sometimes cause pain and heartache. It's not for the faint-hearted. It requires continually stretching outside your comfort zone. It takes a lot of courage to be the best version of yourself. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ross, for this quite in-depth view into Maslow's work.